I'm going to ask you a question. It's going to sound like a simple question, but it's good to hear how it's explained because how would you explain what a progressive is and what a progressive cares about? And perhaps add into that maybe, I don't know what you think, but personally I think the progressive side there's a small group that have damaged the reputation of progressives.
Sure. Well, well, first of all, I think that's true on both sides.
Yeah, fair.
And I do think that if you go back, first of all, I'll say, the group of progressives is very heterogeneous. And, there's no one definition, right? I can go back to my own first principles. And this is actually a very good point. The title of the book is A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, right? It's not the progressive case for Bitcoin. And there's an important distinction there, right?
Good.
I'm giving you my thoughts about Bitcoin through a progressive lens, and hopefully you can learn and run with it. But I'm not trying to speak for all progressives. I can say that from first principles point of view, I think that I want to go about living my life in a decent way and treat people well with dignity and protect the most vulnerable people in society, right? So that's first principle. We talk a lot in the Bitcoin space about collectivism versus individualism, and it's an interesting conversation, right? It's an interesting way to think about the world. And, my personal view, we are a social species. Like, we're animals that have evolved quite literally in our DNA to be around other people and to cooperate. And from a very first principle, there has to be a balance of individual versus the group. And people can have conversations about what that balance is. I'm not saying that you forsake everything and you make every sacrifice for yourself for the betterment of the group, but you don't have the human race without people getting together and helping each other and working together towards projects. So, and that's essentially what I think about in terms of my political position. There's a lot of things that exist right now because of the financial system that we're in. And there's a lot of policies I support because I have that fundamental thing. I want to make sure that the people in our society who are most vulnerable are protected. And that might be, through an economic lens. It might be through a social justice lens. And that's how I think about myself as a progressive, right? And, if I live my life that way and I get to the very end and maybe on my deathbed, I find out, hey, you know what? Like, that was all wrong. Like, you shouldn't have done that, I can still probably die happy because I'm trying to help people. I'm trying to be a good person, and I'm trying to make sure that that's a mistake I'm willing to make. If it turns out to be wrong, I don't think it is. So I think that what's interesting about that sort of first principles, what does it mean to be a progressive and what does it mean for me to be a progressive? It's a very interesting dynamic because all of my thinking and all of my thought process for most of my adult life has been without Bitcoin. And it has existed in a current system that is flawed and inefficient and unfair. And so I have a lot of, I support a lot of ideas that exist now to try to help that system. And I'm open to the idea that if we change the system, if we change the water that we're swimming in, then maybe I can still hold on to those first principle values of, being a decent person that helps the most vulnerable in our society. And it doesn't have to look like it looks now. I don't know what it looks like, and because we don't know what the end game here is. But that's an interesting dynamic for me. I've thought a little bit about if we proceed to this Bitcoin standard, or there's this fiat Bitcoin sort of parallel track, like you mentioned earlier, do I need to have 100% lockstep, all of the same beliefs in terms of policy and decisions that I do now? And I'm open to thinking about those.
And have you thought through that a transition to a Bitcoin standard might naturally lead to a significantly smaller state, and therefore significantly less options for the state to be able to help the most vulnerable in society? And it might mean that some of the ideas with regards to progressives might not come from central policy. It might have to come from voluntary organizations.
It's possible. I don't know that that's necessarily the solution, right? But there's nothing necessarily inherent about a small state that means that my worldview is impossible, right? Okay. And this is why I say I don't need the libertarians to be wrong necessarily, right? If we have some sort of check on our government and say, okay, well, our federal government has to get smaller, or any government has to get smaller because we have this Bitcoin thing, then they just have to make better decisions about what the hell they're doing with their money, right? Like, it's okay, let's fight a few less wars. Let's give, fewer subsidies to fossil fuels. And I think that's why it's important to have progressive voices in there, so we can have a debate of ideas. Like, we have this pot of money now. We can't just print anymore. Like, we need to use it. And if we go into debt, that has to be very careful, and all of those things. And then I don't want libertarians being the only ones making those decisions. I think that liberals and progressives should have a voice in that. So I do think that you can still help people, and you can still have safeguards for very vulnerable people, safety net for people. And the federal government doesn't have to be as big as it is now. And it becomes this dog whistle, right, for a lot of people. Like, well, I want a smaller government. And really, if you're a progressive or a liberal person, not into Bitcoin, then you're probably hearing that say, okay, well, what kind of things do you want to, chop? What do you want to get rid of? And like a lot of times it's like things that protect people who need the help. And so it just becomes a surface level, like, I want a small government. Small government's bad because it doesn't help the people, right? It's like it can go a little deeper than that. And I think that that's a conversation that is worth having.
I agree, definitely worth having. I do just point to the fact in the UK, when we went into a period of austerity under a conservative government, which was a government I think at that time I did vote for, the austerity, the headlines were that it really affected the most vulnerable in society.
Yeah.
They removed our version of welfare for people who were maybe disabled and couldn't work. They moved. They created this thing called it was the bedroom tax, wasn't it? Whereby if you had social housing and it was, say, a 2-bedroom home and you're one person living in there, they tax out of the bedroom. They did lots of things that weren't. It wasn't good policy, where I felt they could have cut from other areas. But that's, I think.
Well, and I think that's critically important to have multiple voices in there, and then you're not always going to get your way. But I do think that it takes work, and I think there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin space who say, all right, I'm just going to plug in this Umbrel node and the world will get better. And it takes work. Like, you have to actually engage with people. You have to bring them in. You have to educate them. You have to make sure they understand why. And the last thing I want is to get into a position where, the government is, all right, well, what do we do? What do we do? Now we have to actually tax people and we can't just print the money. Like, I want all kinds of voices in that conversation, including voices that agree with me, who think that, taxes should be a certain way or the welfare state should be a certain way. Those are conversations that need to happen, and it's going to take work. You can't just say, okay, well, Bitcoin's inevitable, and then just dust your hands off and walk away.
And how do you feel about voices that will come to you with certain claims that I've had to deal with over the time, because I am, to some people in America, considered a lefty.
Sure.
Some of the arguments that come up to me, that the strongest ones are that taxation is theft under the threat of a gun, and that nobody should benefit from the fruits of others' labors. Now, they tend to be people more for the close to no government position, which is a very tough thing to argue against, because in some ways I understand the argument. I think it comes from an ethical place, where it's like, I should not be forced to give anything I've earned to anyone else. I disagree with it, because I think we'll coordinate, but it is a difficult argument.
Well, not for me. I think it's silly. A lot of people would like to think that all of their successes are their successes, right? And that all of the money I earn, I should keep, and you shouldn't decide what to do with it. And it's very appealing on the surface. Nobody is an island, right? And if you have a successful business, part of the reason it's successful is because there's a road that gets you there, and there's regulations that keep the business safe and all of that stuff. So if you live in a society, and I'm thinking even more globally, right? Like, we have a government system right now. It's the state, nation state system. But just as a general rule, if you're benefiting from society, and maybe you have good ideas and you work really hard and you make a lot of money, that's fine. But it's not necessarily wrong to say, all right, well, we are going to, as a collective, we're going to tax you for that, those profits, and then try to do good for the society. Now, we can have all sorts of debates, like, well, how much is the right amount to tax, and how much should we be giving to people who have fallen on hard times or who need help? Those are reasonable debates. And I think that there's a spectrum of right answers, and different people will come to different conclusions. And that's why, maybe you vote and then you figure out, policymakers come to those conclusions. But the idea that like taxation is theft under the threat of violence is, Peter, it's a very fringe idea. Like you walk out of this room, people aren't going to say that, right? Like that's that's some people in Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's less fringe in Bitcoin.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just say plainly, it's absolutely a fringe idea. And I don't even need to say that it's right or wrong. It's a fringe idea.
Yeah.
But the idea that, I live in, like, I'm doing it all myself, and I'm an individual, and I've made this company, and I've done this work. Nobody's doing stuff by themselves. Even if you think you are, you're not. You live in a society, you live in a civilization, and I just think the decent thing to do is to try your best to allocate yourself appropriately.
And have you prepared yourself for the response to this? Because people are in the Bitcoin space, sure, they have strong opinions and they're happy to share them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sometimes in a kind way and sometimes not in a kind way.
Yeah. And the goal for me from the very beginning is to upset as many Bitcoiners and as many progressives as possible, right? They're going to be people, we're going to have a nice conversation here, and I have a long list of things I want to talk to you about. And I'm not going to get to one of them, right? Or maybe two. And so the progressive people who are listening are going to get upset because, hey, you didn't mention like this topic A or topic B. And by the way, if I wrote my book like that, it'd be 1,000 pages long, right? So like I can't do everything. But certainly I'm okay upsetting Bitcoiners. There's a nice, small, vibrant community of people who are into Bitcoin who agree with me and who support, the work that I'm doing and who want to help people and who view the world through the same lens as me. And if you don't, that's fine. Like, again, I'm not trying to change your mind.